The arrival of evil. The old house at the end of Willow Lane had stood abandoned for decades, its windows shattered and its wooden frame weathered by time. A place whispered about in hushed tones by the townspeople, a relic of darkness that no one dared approach after sunset. The stories varied. Some said a family had disappeared overnight, others believed it was cursed. But no one truly knew the horrors hidden within its walls. It was in this forsaken place that Lena and her family decided to make their new home. Lena was 12 years old, a bright and curious girl with a love for old things. Her father, Daniel, was a history professor, and her mother, Sarah, a writer fascinated by folklore. When they stumbled upon the old Victorian house for sale at an impossibly low price, Daniel saw it as an opportunity to own a piece of history, while Sarah imagined it as the perfect setting for her next novel. But Lena, despite her fascination with antiques, felt uneasy from the moment they stepped inside. The house was eerily silent, the air heavy with an unexplainable chill. Shadows clung to the corners like unseen eyes watching them. Yet, what disturbed her most was the doll. They found it in the attic, hidden inside an old wooden chest covered in cobwebs. The doll was delicate, dressed in a tattered crimson dress with lace trimming. Its porcelain face was cracked, its glassy blue eyes staring unblinkingly ahead. Golden curls framed its face, now dulled by dust and age. Lena felt a strange pull toward it, an invisible force urging her to pick it up. The moment her fingers brushed against its porcelain skin, a shiver ran down her spine. "Lena, put that down," Sarah warned, her voice laced with unease. "But it's just a doll," Lena protested. Daniel chuckled. "It's an antique. Maybe it's worth something." Sarah remained skeptical, but she didn't argue. Lena, feeling a strange attachment to the doll, decided to keep it. She cleaned it gently, setting it on a chair in her room. That night, as she drifted off to sleep, she swore she heard whispering. Faint, almost inaudible. The voice of a child. The first night, Lena awoke to the sound of footsteps in her room. Slow, deliberate steps creaking against the wooden floorboards. Her heart pounded as she reached for the bedside lamp. Nothing. The doll still sat in the chair, its glassy eyes reflecting the dim light. But something felt different. The air was thick with an invisible presence, something that made her skin crawl. She turned over, convincing herself it was just her imagination. But as she closed her eyes, a giggle echoed through the darkness, a soft, eerie sound that made her blood run cold. Strange occurrences. Over the next few days, unsettling things began happening. The doll never stayed where Lena left it. At first, she thought she was simply forgetting where she placed it. But soon, it became undeniable. One morning, she woke up to find the doll sitting at the foot of her bed, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Another time, it appeared on her desk, its cracked lips almost forming a smile. Then came the nightmares. Lena dreamt of a little girl in an old-fashioned dress, her face obscured by shadows. The girl would stand in the doorway, whispering Lena's name in a voice that sent chills down her spine. "Let me in," the girl would say. Each time, Lena would wake up drenched in sweat, gasping for breath. The whispering shadows. But the worst part wasn't the dream. Lena began to feel as though the doll was watching her, its glassy eyes always fixed on her every movement. No matter where she moved it, no matter how carefully she tucked it away, it would always return to the same spot, the chair by the window, waiting for her. She started to question her sanity. She was sure she hadn't moved the doll herself, and yet there it was every time she turned around. It was almost as if it were calling her, beckoning her to come closer. Her mother, Sarah, noticed the change in Lena. The once bright and energetic girl had grown withdrawn, her eyes constantly darting around the room, as though she was trying to avoid being seen by something. "Lena, you're looking pale. You haven't been sleeping well, have you?" Sarah asked one evening as Lena sat staring at the doll in her room, her fingers twitching slightly in the air as if to touch it, but pulling back in hesitation. "I'm fine, Mom," Lena replied quickly, though her voice trembled. She couldn't admit it, couldn't explain the creeping sensation that was now a permanent fixture in her life. The house felt like it was closing in on her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It wasn't just the doll anymore. Other things started happening too. Objects in her room would go missing, only to be found in places she knew she hadn't put them. The door to her closet, which had always creaked when opened, now slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing through the silence of the night. But it was the whispers, always the whispers, that made Lena's blood run cold. They were faint at first, a low murmur she couldn't quite understand. But over time, they grew clearer, more distinct. "Help me!" The voice, a child's voice, soft yet full of desperate yearning, seemed to come from behind the walls themselves. It made her heart race in fear, but she told herself she was imagining things, nothing more than the house settling or the wind creeping through the cracks in the old structure. But Lena wasn't the only one hearing the whispers. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Sarah suddenly froze mid-bite, her fork suspended in the air. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mom, it's just the wind," Daniel reassured her, but Lena could see the unease in his eyes. "No, it sounded like a child's voice." Sarah's voice faltered. A little girl, calling for help. Lena's heart skipped a beat. Could her mother be hearing the same things? Could it be real? But when Lena turned her gaze toward the doll that sat motionless on the shelf, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The doll's eyes were no longer fixed in one direction. They were moving, slowly but unmistakably, following Lena's every movement as if it had a life of its own. That night, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the air growing thick with tension. The whispers were louder now, almost as though they were coming from inside the room. Lena sat up in bed, her body stiff with fear, and looked toward the chair where the doll sat. And that's when she saw it. The doll's lips moved. Not just a twitch or a trick of the light, but a clear, deliberate movement. It was smiling. A twisted, malevolent grin that stretched across its porcelain face. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she slowly backed away from the bed, her legs trembling beneath her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The doll was alive, and it wanted something from her. The next day, unearthly encounters. The next morning, Lena found herself awake before the sun, her body stiff and exhausted from the restless night. But the strange happenings had only intensified. She couldn't escape the doll's watchful presence. The whispers hadn't stopped. In fact, they seemed to grow louder each time she was alone. Lena had tried to ignore them, tried to tell herself that they were just the sounds of an old house, creaking floors, shifting walls, but deep down, she knew she couldn't escape the truth. The doll was connected to the voices. It was the source. That afternoon, Lena went down to the basement to fetch some boxes for her mother. The basement was damp and musty, the air heavy with a smell of mildew and rotting wood. It was dark, and the only light came from the single bulb overhead that flickered intermittently. As Lena dug through the boxes, she heard something shift behind her. She turned, her eyes wide with fear. Nothing. But the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Then, suddenly, she heard the voice again. Clearer than ever, it whispered from the dark corner of the basement. "Help me, Lena." She whipped around, her pulse racing. The voice was unmistakably coming from the direction of an old, dust-covered trunk. Lena hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at her insides, but curiosity overpowered her. She took a slow step toward the trunk, her heart hammering in her chest. With trembling hands, she pulled the lid open. Inside, there was nothing but old, rotting clothes and forgotten belongings. But then, as she sifted through the mess, something caught her eye, another doll. This one was different. Its face was even more cracked than the first, and it had a sinister, unsettling aura around it. The eyes were wide open, but there was no glass, just dark, hollow sockets staring back at her. Lena recoiled in horror. Then, in a whisper too soft to hear, but too loud to ignore, the doll's mouth moved. "Why did you leave me?" The return of the doll. Lena dropped the doll and bolted out of the basement, the cold air biting at her skin as she rushed up the stairs. Her mind was racing. What was happening? Why were these dolls tormenting her? She locked herself in her room and tried to calm her breathing, but the sense of dread in the air was suffocating. As she sat on the edge of her bed, the soft giggle she had heard the night before returned. It wasn't coming from the doll in the chair. Lena's eyes darted around the room, panic rising in her chest. Then, slowly, she turned to look at the chair. And there, sitting as if it had never moved, was the first doll. Its glassy eyes stared directly at her, and the once innocent smile now twisted into something far more sinister. Lena had no choice. She had to uncover the truth. And so, with a trembling hand, she reached for the doll again.